Okay, so this is part 3, or if you are looking at this from another CLIPS mission, it's going to be part 2 of how you design PDS4 labels. And first thing we're going to do is recap what we did before so you can remember what we were talking about and get this in context. So we talked a little bit about what a PDS label is for and what it looks like. We talked about how you design it, those 4 areas that are part of any science product label. And then we talked about what you do with the label that you have designed. And we stopped when we got down to validating. And that's what we're mostly going to talk about today. So just to remind you, all science products have a PDS4 label that follows this structure and answers these questions over here in blue. The first part is the identification area that includes the unique identifier that every PDS product has. It also includes the observation area that answers all those reporter questions: when, where, how, why, by whom was this data product acquired. The reference list has references to things inside PDS, like perhaps the user's guide, and also things outside PDS, like perhaps the instrument paper. Just about anything that's got a PDS identifier or a DOI can be put into the reference list. And then finally, file area observational is the part of the label that describes the data file in sufficient detail for software to be able to read it. Like if it's an image, it's number of lines, number of samples, data type, how many bands, and so forth. If it's a table, it's what the columns are, what the data type of the columns are, what's the definition of this, so forth and so on. That's what's in that last bit. So we talked about this before. You have a label design, so now what? How do you go from the design to producing real labels? There are these 3 parts. You turn your label design into a template with some blanks or placeholders that you will fill in. You have some metadata somewhere that will be used to fill in the blanks. You combine those 2 things with some kind of production software, and out pops a batch of labels. That's just a very high-level view of how that could work. So to remind you, we talked about making a template out of your draft label. This was a nervous example that we used. You see the template pieces are in red here. These are the parts of the label that will change depending on, for each separate data product. Each product will have a different name here, will have a different start and stop time, will have a different file name, and so forth. So you identify all those things in the label that will be changed for each product, and you give them placeholders. And I have used the syntax of $, and curly brackets, and then a variable name. I chose that syntax because the software that I would use to turn this into a real label understands this syntax. It doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. If you have your own software, your processing pipeline, and you want to use some other kind of variable designation, you can do that. So this is for the PDS MI label tool that understands how to read this syntax. And this is actually, if you want to get into the details, there's a language for these templates called Velocity that uses this syntax. And the MI label tool reads this and uses the Velocity template language to fill in the blanks. This is what we all talked about last time, so I'm not going to go over this too much. So we've got the template. We've got some production software that could be a PDS tool, could be your own software. And then finally, we need the metadata that is used to fill in the blanks. That could be a CSV table, a spreadsheet, could be a database, whatever your software can read to locate the metadata to crunch out all these individual labels. So that's where we are. We have, once you've got your batch of labels, can you just send them to PDS? No, sorry, you can't. You have to validate them first. So we're going to talk a lot about validation, why you have to do it, how you download and install the validate tool. It's just called validate in PDS. You have to use our tool. How you download and install dictionaries if you need to. You might not. How you run the validate tool and what the results look like, what the report looks like. how you run it if you are using local copies of dictionaries. I will briefly go over all the command line switches that Validate understands. There's a whole bunch of them. And then what to do if you think you found a bug, which does happen. I've found a few. To start with, why do you need to validate a label? The short answer is because PDS says so. When you deliver to PDS, we want you to also deliver the validation report. The reason, even though we are going to run Validate on our side, we want you to run it first because it will help you catch and correct a whole bunch of stupid little errors that otherwise we would have to say, oh, well, we found this and you didn't capitalize this, or you left off of something, and will you please redo it? And that kind of back and forth can go on for weeks. It will be much faster if you would just run it yourselves and catch those little errors and fix them before you deliver it to PDS. And we're still going to run Validate when we get it, just so that we have a record. It will check all kinds of things. The one thing that Validate does that the old validation tool that worked on PDS4 did not do is that Validate will actually look inside the data file and will see if the label description is actually correct. For instance, if your data file has 12 columns of data, but your label describes 13 columns, Validate will point that out. Say one of your columns is defined as containing integers, and yet you look in the file and it actually contains some text, Validate will not like that, and it will point that out. That's really very helpful. We could not do that in PDS4. We could not catch those kinds of mismatches between label and actual data product. You can turn that switch off. It's called content validation. So if you've done it once, it kind of takes a long time, especially if you have images. So if you've done it once and you are sure that your content is correct, but you need to fix other things, you can turn off the content validation to make it go faster the next time. So other things that it will check is, do your metadata in your label actually conform to the specifications in the dictionaries that you're using? Do you have all the required pieces? Do you have them in the right order? Do you use values that are approved in the dictionaries? It's very picky, and this will seem tedious at first, but it will actually save a lot of trouble and misunderstanding in the long run if you have carefully defined your dictionary, your mission dictionary, and so forth. So remember that products are grouped together into collections, and collections are grouped into bundles, and both collections and bundles have their own labels. Validate will check those also. It will look in your collection label, and it will look in the list of products that are supposed to be in this collection, and it will make sure that they're really there. We'll also look at the products you've got and make sure that they are all listed in the collection inventory. So it checks both ways. It will point out if there are stray files that don't seem to belong, or if you're missing a file, or if the version number is wrong. And same thing for the bundle labels. It will make sure that all the collections the bundle label says should be in there are actually in there. It will finally check your PDS context product references. Remember, context products are the official PDS registrations for missions, spacecraft, instruments, and targets. And it will look to see that you have the right identifiers in your label to refer to those things. And so Validate is very powerful, but it's also, shall we say, persnickety. It's easy to upset it. So PDS is ready to help you install it and use it and get over that learning curve at the beginning. So here's where you go to get it. It is a GitHub repository. It's like all the PDS tools. You go to that URL up here under Validate. It does require you to install it on a machine that uses Java 9.0 or higher. And I am going to walk through how you actually find the thing that you download because it's not immediately obvious. Somebody's mic is open. Could you all mute if you're not? Thanks. Okay, so you go to this address and there's a bunch of stuff there. thing that you need to click on is this thing here that says Validate GitHub Repo Repository. You click there. This gets you to this page, typical GitHub repository page. And if you're not familiar with GitHub, you will wonder, what do I do now? So just ignore all this stuff and go over here to the right side, look for releases, look for the green button that says latest. That's the latest release of Validate. Click that one. And this finally will get you to the latest release, as you know, because there it is. And you have a choice. You can download a zip file or a tar gzipped file, doesn't matter. They contain the same thing. Whichever kind of zip you like, pick one of those and install it on your system. You can go back to the main GitHub page where we started, click Installation in the toolbar over here, and that will give you more complete instructions about how you actually install it. You do have to do a couple things. On Windows, you have to define a couple of environment variables so that it knows where to find your Java software. And there are also instructions on Unix systems and I think Macs too. I don't remember. It's supposed to work on any platform. I've only used it on Windows. So that's what you do to get your installation going. So in order to do a complete validation, the Validate tool needs access to the PDS4 dictionary and any other dictionaries that are mentioned in your labels. So published dictionaries are online at PDS under the Dictionaries subdirectory here. And as long as you are on a machine with an internet connection, Validate will just go look there and find these dictionaries, and you don't have to do anything. But during development, sometimes you will need to use a dictionary that's not published yet on that site. In that case, you will have to have local copies of the dictionary, not just the one that's not published, but all the dictionaries that are mentioned in your labels. You will need to have local copies on your machine, and then there will be a way to tell Validate to look there for the dictionaries. So why would you want to use an unpublished dictionary? For instance, maybe it's a mission dictionary, and the mission has not yet had its first release, so the dictionary is not published. It's a working draft. You don't want it to be published yet, so you would need a local copy. Or maybe it's one of the regular PDS discipline dictionaries, say cartography or geometry, but it's a new version that has not yet been publicly released. Maybe there was a change made just for the Viper mission at somebody's request, and you are testing it before it becomes public. That's another example of why you might want to use an unpublished dictionary. So where do you go to get those dictionaries so that you can have them on your local machine? You go here, github.com, PDS Data Dictionaries. This is what that page looks like, and there is a repositories button near the top there. You click that, and that gets you a list of all the dictionaries. You can download them from there. All right, this is a little, I'll get back to that in a second. I was not sure whether to include this slide or not, but since I did, I'll just tell you about it. I wonder why you need local copies of all the dictionaries that are in your label. And it seems to me there ought to be a way in Validate to just say, look here locally for the unpublished dictionaries and continue to look online for the published dictionaries. And there should be a way to do that, and I have not been able to figure it out. There is a thing called a catalog file. It has nothing to do with the old PDS3 catalog files. It's just a way of tricking XML reading software into looking somewhere else for dictionaries. This is kind of a complicated and advanced topic beyond this tutorial, but any Validate aficionados who are listening, here is your chance to improve this tutorial. I have not figured out how to get Validate to look in two places at once for dictionaries. Maybe it's possible. Maybe this slide can be replaced at some future date. Anyway, say you have gone to GitHub, you have downloaded
Susie,
all those dictionaries. Sure.
this is Kate.
Yeah.
I just want to say I have not found how to do two places at once. And I have found that if you're not very careful specifying your local dictionaries, you can have Validate skip a dictionary and throw everything into disarray. So
Yes.
Just a note to everyone, if you are doing the local dictionaries, just be really careful with your specifications.
Yeah, you can royally screw things up. I know one thing that you have to do, which we will point out later, when you tell Validate what dictionaries to use, you should always put the PDS core dictionary first in the list. And then it might matter what order you put the other ones in too.
So yes, it actually does matter which order, and the precedence is the first one listed,
Yeah.
and that specifies the rule order. So yes, you can also mess up that way, and yes, I have messed up several times that way.
This is gone into in some detail in the online help for Validate. There are examples of how you refer to dictionaries and what order you're supposed to put them in. So if you get stuck, ask PDS for help, and we'll do our best. So I recommend when you have downloaded dictionaries, if you are going to be using some unpublished ones, that you create a directory structure locally that looks like this, that mimics the PDS directory structure online. That is, you have your local directory, you have a subdirectory named PDS4. Underneath that, you have a subdirectory for each dictionary. Here's the core PDS dictionary that's just named PDS. Below that, there's a V1, version 1. So far, there's only V1. And then in there is where you put all these dictionary files. There's 6 or 7 of them for each dictionary. Similarly, there is a subdirectory for each of the discipline dictionaries like Geom or Proc or Cart. They have a V1 underneath that, and then they have all the files underneath the V1 directory. Missions are a little bit different because they have another level. There's a mission subdirectory, and then beneath that, there is a subdirectory for each different mission if you have some reason to have more than one. So there would be one for Viper. There's a Viper mission dictionary, then V1, and then all those files go in there. If you set it up this way, and you eventually want to use the catalog file trick that I've just mentioned, your life will be a lot easier if you've done it this way. Trust me.
Yeah, this is really good to know in advance. And
yes, it is.
We have a new member on our team, Elaine Talley, who's joining us, and she's going to be helping us generate the mission dictionaries, but we still need to work with PDS to identify what's in our mission dictionary. So work ahead for the team, and this has always been on the discussion about what are we putting in our dictionaries and what's available from the main PDS dictionary. So but it's good to know that there's an order. These all have to be done and be ready prior to any sort of validation and also the generation of our labels. All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so assume you have installed Validate according to the instructions, and you've installed the dictionaries. How do you run it? You go back to this main page, and you click here on the toolbar under Operation, and that will get you all the online help. It's pretty comprehensive. But we'll go through a few simple examples just to show you what to expect. So Validate is a command line tool. There's no pointy, clicky interface. It's the old-fashioned command line. And this first command is just a very simplified version. It's you name Validate, you give it the name of one label, and this -r, lowercase r switch tells it send the output to this file, report.txt. Pretty simple. And there's a lot of switches that can turn on and off, so it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with them so you know which ones are on and off by default. One that is on by default is the content validation. So since I haven't said anything about it in my command line, it's going to be on, and it will actually read this label, look for the pointer to the data file, and see if what's in the data file conforms to what the label says should be in there. That's just one label. You might want to do a whole directory tree of labels, and that's how you do this in this next example. You put in the path name to the directory. There's the -r report.txt, but this time I've turned off content validation with this -d switch, capital D. So this will tell Validate, do all the labels that are in and below this directory and not to do content validation on them, and send the output to that report file. And I have put in, as I told you, I use Windows to run this program, so my paths look like window paths with the backslash. They would look like forward slashes if you're on a Unix platform. So one more step in complication. is to tell Validate to do a whole collection. So in this case, I'm giving it the path to the collection root directory. I'm putting in this capital R switch and then the value PDS4.collection, which says treat this directory as a collection, validate it as a collection. So it will do the regular validation that we've already done. It will check the labels and the content validation, since I have not turned that off. And it will also do additional things that you check with a collection. For example, it will look in the inventory and make sure that the contents of the collection are actually as they are listed in the inventory. And it will do a few other things, referential integrity checks. Then the highest level of complication is to tell it to do a bundle validation. So this is the command to validate the whole bundle. Give it the bundle root directory. You use this PDS4.bundle value for this switch, and then the output to the report file. And it will do additional bundle and collection checks. So this will do the whole thing. It will do every label, including content validation. It will do collection validation, and it will do bundle validation. And that's the whole thing. I should probably say, if you don't put in the report output, if you don't redirect your output to the report file, it will all just go by on your screen really fast. It's not what you want. Okay, so this is a lot to absorb. I'm going to pause for a few seconds in case anybody's got a question.
Do you recommend you do trials with really simple labels and then expand the labels and start adding more things in, or is that?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact,
so you could do.
This is the way I do it.
Okay.
Start with one label, then do a directory, then do the collection, then do the bundle.
But I'm also thinking if we just when we're practicing making labels and we say we don't have yet our Viper mission directory available, local directory, and we're just using PDS directories, which you've identified, some basic things like start clock time and stop clock time and things like that. We could still test out that part. We can just okay. Yeah. All right.
Right, and I'd argue that's the way that we should do it, because that forces you to look through the existing dictionaries to make sure that you can use them, right? I mean, the ideal end state would be that we add no special, you know, right, if we can get away with it, right, or the minimum amount that we can.
Yeah, notice that I haven't said anything in these example commands about local dictionaries. So by default, validate will just go online to the regular PDS dictionary place and use whatever version of those dictionaries is online. So we're going to get to another example in a minute where I show you how you tell Validate to look for local versions of the dictionaries. So here's what comes out of Validate. That is the default text file that comes out as a report. There are other kinds of reports. You can tell it to make a JSON file, and I forget, an XML file, I think, if you have. I guess you would want that if you had software that was going to read your validation report and you wanted to automate that in some way. But this is the human readable and the typical output from Validate. So the first thing I usually do when I'm looking at a validation report is I skip to the end. So the thing I look at the end is the product validation summary. I see that there's a product that failed here, one product. And the message types tells you what different types of error messages occurred, which kind of gives you a hint about why this failed. So then I would, looking at this in my editor, I would just pick one of these message types and do a search through the whole report to see what the error message looked like. So that's what I'm going to do on the next screen. I'll show you that in my editor, I'm going to search for this string error.table.fields mismatch. Here in my editor, that's what I'm searching for. Here's that particular error message. It says in the first table, in the first record, you have the wrong number of fields. It was looking for this many, but it found this many. That's a typical example. In fact, you can see all three types of the error message for this particular report here on this screen. The first three are complaining that it can't find context products for those particular context products. These are Viper examples. So I will, just for a brief digression, those context products have been entered and registered at PDS. The reason Validate is saying it can't find them is because Validate software carries with it its own list of context products. There's a file that you can actually look at in the distribution, and it's only updated every 6 months or whenever Validate is updated. So the Validate version that I'm using to make this report has not been updated since those Viper products were, context products were registered, so they're not in the list. And there are ways to get around that. You can tell Validate to look somewhere else, or you can tell it to actually put them in your list of context products. I wouldn't worry about it. If it says it can't find a context product, just check to make sure you spelled it right, and if you spell it right, you're fine. Eventually they'll get in there.
Yeah, Susie, I thought we agreed that we were going to have the underscore, but if you moved us to dots between,
I don't remember.
Okay.
That could be. It could be that I have misspelled it in my test label because I couldn't remember either. And there is an easy way to look and see what the context products actually are online. There's a public PDF page that lists them all.
Okay.
So we could check those things. It might be that I have made the error here because I used an old label that spelled them wrong. I don't remember.
Okay.
So that's one type of error. The one we just talked about was the fields mismatched. And then here's a string of errors that look all the same. And you'll see what it's doing is going through every record, every line, every row in the table and reporting the same error. So what is going on here? Value data type mismatch. In record 1, field 17, the value does not match its data type, which is ASCII integer. And sure enough, here's the value from the data file. It's not an integer. It should have been labeled ASCII real. And it will report that for every line in, every line in the table. And I used a short table with only 20 records. So that's just an example, typical output from Validate and how you would track down what the error is and how to fix it. Okay. Going on, because we've only got a little bit left here. So how do you tell Validate where to look for local copies of dictionaries if you are using them? Well, if you were going to do this on the command line, this is what the command would look like. It's pretty uncomfortable because you have a lot of typing to do. There are 2 switches here. This -X is telling it, look here for this XSD file, which is a schema, an XML schema. And it's telling it, look for the core PDS schema right there, and look for the Viper mission dictionary schema right there. Then the second switch is -F. That stands for schematron, which is the other pair, the other file in the pair that goes with any data dictionary. There's always a schema and a schematron. And it's giving the file names for the schematron for the core dictionary and for the Viper mission dictionary. Well, this is a lot of stuff to type, and you're bound to make a mistake. So there's got to be a better way to do this. And indeed, there is a better way. You put all that stuff into a file, a configuration file. So here in blue is my configuration file. And there I have put those file names into the file, so I only have to type it once. Then the command line is just Validate. There's the directory path, and -C, use my configuration file here. There are examples of configuration files in the online documentation for Validate, and you can tell it all, just about anything that has a command line switch can be put into the config file. So look, I put also the report file in here, and I put skip the content validation, and I put which level of reporting do I want. Just about anything can go into the config file. It has comments. The hash mark starts a comment line. This backslash at the end means continuation on the next line, so this is really supposed to be one long input line here. And Validate should figure out the directory delimiters, but I've put in Unix style path delimiters here, and I think if you were to put in backslashes like Windows style, that it would convert them to forward slashes. The developers are Unix guys, they like forward slashes. I have a whole bunch of config files set up when I'm doing standard validation of deliveries. I have one that just does labels for individual products. I have one that does a whole bundle, and I find it much easier to just go tweak the config file rather than trying to remember to type all that stuff. on the command line. So if you're running validate and you get this kind of warning message where it says, failed to read the schema document because it couldn't find it, or it could not be read, or it's not a schema, or if you get an error message like this, I can't find the declaration of the element product observational. Remember, that's the main class in your label. It's most likely that it's not looking in the right place for the dictionary files. That's probably the only thing that would produce this error. So that means you should go look in your config file and make sure you've got the right path and file names there for your dictionaries. There's a bunch of command line switches. You can just type -H on the command line to see them all, and I will just switch over and do that so you can see what they look like. See if you can figure this out. Wake up, little computer. There we go. I have this actually printed out to a piece of paper that I use for my cheat sheet. I don't have to remember it every time. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Most of these things have two flavors. You use a single hyphen, the short version, and then there's a double hyphen, which lets you spell it out, which is useful to put in your configuration file just so that it's clear what that switch is going to do. You can read all those when you get ready to do this. And as I say, the online help is pretty complete. It will tell you in detail what all those switches do. So finally, validate is updated every time the PDS dictionary is updated. PDS, the whole system is updated, which is about every 6 months. And it does evolve, and it does sometimes evolve the wrong way. It's a living piece of software, so it will have bugs occasionally. It has a standard GitHub method for reporting bugs. So I suggest if you think you have found a bug, if you look at your label and you're sure it's right and validate does not like it, the first thing to do is ask somebody at PDS to see if you've overlooked something obvious. The next thing you could try is to make sure you have the latest version of validate, and also that you have the latest version of dictionaries if you're using local copies, and to make sure that your dictionary references in your labels are pointing to the right versions of those dictionaries. So if that doesn't fix the problem, you could look in the GitHub repository issues and see if anybody else has experienced the same problem, and if someone is already working on it. They're pretty prompt at getting to these things, but there is, if you go there, there is a lot of stuff on that list. They're not all bugs. Some of them are requests for improvement. If it's a true bug, it will get quick attention. If it's just a, I wish validate would do this, it will not happen so quickly. But validate is probably PDS's most important tool, so the developers really want to get on that if there's a real bug. And if it's not in that list, you can report it yourself, or you can ask PDS to report for you. There's a button on that page that says New Issue, and it will ask you, as you submit your report, it will ask you to upload examples of the labels that don't work and explain exactly what you were expecting to happen. And so you need to be prepared to make a complete report if you're going to do that. Okay. So to recap, here's where we are. We're almost to the end. We have talked about all these ways of parts of designing the label and what you do with the label you have designed and how you validate it. And I'm almost to the end now. The very last page is the references. Here they are. We've talked about some of these before, but I did add validate at the bottom of this table. That is it. Any questions?